So for 5 years, I had protracted withdrawal sensations from psychiatric drugs. I was very scared that these drugs had just damaged me forever. I constantly wondered, will my brain and body recover? Will my nervous system, re-find its balance after getting profoundly disturbed, by all these drugs that I took? Or maybe could my nervous system find some other ways, some new way to reach a homeostasis? So that's the topic of this video. Please note I'm not a licensed medical professional or researcher, but I think exploring these questions yields unexpected results that run contrary to what is sometimes presented to the public. There are theories out there propagated by psychiatrists and others that the probable cause of protracted withdrawal syndrome is related to the serotonin system or some other imbalance of neurotransmitters. Does this sound familiar? Psychiatrists are obsessed with talking about these specific chemicals as the source of human distress, even in our post-psychiatry suffering. So here's a snippet from a Mad in America podcast with such a psychiatrist.
When you stop the antidepressants, your serotonin levels go back to normal because it blocks one of the receptors, the blockage goes away, but your brain doesn't just snap back into how it was before the drug was there. Those adaptations, those changes take a while to get back to normal. And in fact, in one study, after stopping antidepressants in patients, there were changes in the serotonin system for up to 4 years after stopping. And in animal studies, they find similar findings, that there are changes to the hormonal system that can last, we think, for months or years. And that is probably why withdrawal symptoms can last for so long, is because of the residual effects on the brain after stopping the drugs.
Now, he goes on to say that they don't really know what's going on, but this is just what they think. And I think it's very probable that this explains acute withdrawal, that the brain must readapt itself to life after the drugs. But if someone is, really struggling, as I was, with protracted sensations going on for a long time, maybe years, is this still always a viable explanation? Well, here's a quote from the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines. Protracted withdrawal symptoms are thought to be caused by changes to the brain during exposure, generally long-term, to antidepressants, which persist for months and years after stopping the drugs. Indeed, there is PET imaging, which demonstrates changes to serotogenic receptor sensitivity for months and years after the drug is stopped. Now, these quotations I've given from both the podcast and the Deprescribing Guidelines actually give the same academic, or one of the same academic references as evidence for this idea that the serotonin system or related hormones are probably responsible for protracted withdrawal sensations. But, if we actually look at this reference, which is a brain imaging study, it reveals that these psychiatrists are kind of making misleading statements that fail to provide absolutely essential context. So here is the actual study, persistent reduction in brain serotonin 1A receptor, etc., etc. And in this study, the participants were divided into 2 groups. One who had never taken antidepressants before, and another group who had taken them, but had stopped them about 6 months to several years ago. And what they found in this study is that the people who had previously taken antidepressants, there was comparably significant decreases in certain serotonin receptors. And this suggests that these downregulated receptors, as a result of taking the drugs, could take years to bounce back, if at all. And the psychiatrists I previously quoted on that podcast in the Deprescribing Guidelines, that's what they rightly pointed out. However, they also stated that this is what's probably causing protracted withdrawal syndrome. But here's why this is misleading. Because the participants in this study with fewer serotonin receptors, they actually felt fine. They weren't in withdrawal. They weren't depressed. They felt healthy. In fact, a prerequisite of the study was that all the participants who entered it, they felt well. So then how is this the cause of protracted withdrawal syndrome? The way this information was presented is, again, it's kind of misleading. Now, I'm not saying, they're doing this intentionally, but it definitely lacks context. Because again, these people are not in withdrawal. Now, the authors might backpedal and say, well, maybe it's not the serotonin system per se, but some other neurotransmitter systems, because they've been shown to be altered too in animal studies. And yeah, sure. But it's the serotonin receptors which are presumably the most implicated in SSRI drug withdrawal. And if these receptors haven't fully recovered yet, and yet people felt fine, then why should we assume that other chemical receptors that are less directly involved are now responsible for the syndrome? Especially since we're being kind of misled to start with, it makes me wonder, what else is not being said? So why are they doing this? Why are they saying this? Well, again, I'm not saying the authors are intentionally misleading us, but it's pretty apparent that they've just kind of accepted a traditional biomedical model for protracted withdrawal, probably because this model is what they were educated with. And unfortunately, this biomedical model has been a travesty for decades in its attempt to understand mysterious syndromes, like most recently protracted withdrawal. So let's actually take a brief look at why this is, and then we can look at how people are actually going around these bioreductionistic ideas to actually heal themselves. And that's not to say that people can't resolve things with this biomedical model, but it's not necessarily going to give everyone the whole story. It's not going to be the solution for everyone. The biomedical model is the dominant model in the medical industry, including psychiatry. And it's this idea that something is always broken or diseased or off balance. Now, to be fair, this biomedical model has value for acute withdrawal, certain aspects of tapering, and specific iatrogenic injuries, and other more general things like a broken arm or maybe an infection. But for those of us with mysterious syndromes that go on and on, they generally have no idea, why this is happening. So they just start, blaming things that are in line with this model. So they blame structures in the body, things that might not look right but have no direct implication, or maybe they blame, genes. That's a very popular one. But when no explanatory cause is actually found, this approach fails miserably. And how do we know this? Well, as scientific research has picked up steam and got more advanced, especially on, medically mysterious syndromes, looking for all these different changes. Despite this, there's now record numbers of people with chronic pain, migraines, fibromyalgia, eczema, chronic fatigue. Now there's long COVID, and how many people are psychiatrized now with all of these just totally meaningless labels? And when professionals don't know what's going on, they just kind of medicalize people and give them drugs or maybe surgery. And, in some ways, people are more disabled today, than they have, previously. So I think future research on protracted withdrawal syndrome, seems probably likely to yield similar results. But instead, if we look at it, as if the serotonin system or related systems aren't the direct cause of protracted withdrawal, which is suggested by the research I talked about, we could ask, why is this? Why aren't these biochemical changes that important? And we could also ask, what's actually what's the root cause causing these withdrawal sensations to persist? So there's actually research and clinical trials now moving away from traditional biomedical models, and they're having some real success for a range of mysterious long-term syndromes. Take certain pain syndromes, for instance. Many people are told who have chronic pain that they had this pain as a result of a structural problem or a muscular imbalance or some nervous system problem. But for the vast majority of people, this is not the cause of their pain. In fact, 2 clinical trials, one on something called pain reprocessing therapy, the other one on something called psychophysiologic symptom relief therapy. In these studies, 70 to 75% of participants who completed these studies resolved the pain or almost resolved the pain entirely. And comparably, in the usual care group, only 20 to 25% of people resolved the pain. So there's obviously just a massive difference here, and these are absolutely landmark studies. But, the question, of course, comes, why are these approaches so superior? Well, there are several factors, of course, but one major one is that the people in the usual care group, they're still told that something is wrong with them. And you can, read tons of frightening stuff on chronic pain, all the biochemical and neurophysiological changes in the body. And one might think that these are the ultimate cause of the pain. But, if you just think about it, in our daily life, there's also a bunch of biochemical changes in the body when we cry, for instance. But that's not the reason for why we cry. Usually it's because we're having some emotional response to something. And likewise, these biochemical, neurophysiological changes for pain, a lot of times they generally don't matter, or at least they're not the root cause of the pain, because something deeper is going on. And what's being demonstrated now in these successful clinical trials is what can truly cause the pain is a continual sense of danger that our minds are interpreting. An alarm signal that just keeps going off in the brain that feeds directly into the brain's processing of pain itself. In part, this is just, the fear, I think, driven within people by believing that they're physically damaged or whatever, other sense of danger someone might be perceiving, whether it's physical or emotional, because emotional threats can also keep this danger signal going as well. So in pain reprocessing therapy, for instance, people learn, and I think this is why one of the reasons it's effective, is people learn that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with them. And so they begin to change the relationship to the sensations that they feel. And they do some specific work in this regard, and the pain is then very likely to resolve. And this has also been used successfully for people with long COVID without tissue damage, but who still think, they're damaged, they've been harmed by this virus irreversibly. And anecdotally, people have used this approach for so many different syndromes, including protracted withdrawal sensations, which is something that worked for me as well. So when psychiatrists tell us, that something is wrong with our serotonin system, or, whatever it might be, without providing proof, not even, providing context for their statements, they're potentially perpetuating the syndrome. They're actually potentially setting people up to get worse. And it's by learning that we're not damaged, despite how badly we might feel, and it's by, addressing other things that might be making us feel unsafe, that we can actually begin toward resolving the syndrome. Because in these cases, the long-term changes to the neurophysiological system, to the biochemical systems, they might just be completely inconsequential. And we've put more gravitas, more weight on them than they actually deserve. I'll give one more example of why these biochemical changes for long-term syndromes, why they might not matter. So take pain rehabilitation physician John Sarno, for instance, whose ideas were used in these clinical trials I mentioned. When he would see people for chronic pain, when he would first see them, he would push down on certain areas of their back. And this would almost always trigger pain for them. And people without chronic pain, he could push down on these same areas and they'd feel basically nothing. They'd almost certainly not cause them pain. Then after the people who had pain went through Sarno's program, resolved the pain, got back to living their lives, they'd have a follow-up with Sarno. And once again, Sarno would push down on their back again, these key areas. And guess what? They would still have pain, but only when he pushed down on them. This had absolutely no bearing on their day-to-day pain-free life. So what this means is that there can be persistent neurophysiological changes that last perhaps indefinitely, but they are totally irrelevant to our everyday life. They are totally irrelevant to our healing. Because injuries heal, but they might not do so in a way we expect them to. Sometimes the brain can be smarter than us, and find other ways of rebalancing itself in ways we might not understand, in ways that the biomedical model is too limited to understand. But thankfully, there is this emerging world beyond this bio one, and there are new ways of understanding protracted withdrawal. So if any of this resonates with you, you can actually find out more about the approaches I mentioned here on a resource page I have on my free Substack. I've made other videos about this topic as well. So feel free to check that out. And, I wish you all the best, no matter what path that you choose.